The first time Malachi Brooks saw her, it felt less like noticing a stranger and more like remembering someone he'd been waiting for all his life. The sky had gone black in a heartbeat, the kind of darkness that swallowed the horizon whole. Wind tore at the corral gates, rattling the chains like a warning. Malachi was halfway to the barn when the rain came, sheets of it, cold and heavy, slapping against his face. He hunched his shoulders, muttering under his breath about the fickleness of the plains when a flicker of movement caught his eye. If you're a true Wild West soul, drop a big yes in the comments. Let's see who's still riding the trail with us. She emerged from the tree line like a shadow forced into the light. Long black hair clung to her shoulders, plastered to the wet buckskin that hugged her frame. She was stumbling, each step deliberate but weak, as if the ground beneath her fought back. Even from a distance, Malachi could see it. She wasn't just battling the storm. "Ma'am," he called, splashing through the mud toward her. She turned her head, and in that split second of lightning, he saw her eyes. Dark, sharp, and full of something he couldn't name. Not fear of him, fear of something else. Her gaze flicked over her shoulder toward the forest before returning to him. "I cannot stay," she said, her voice nearly drowned by the rumble overhead. The words were careful, measured, touched with an unfamiliar accent. "My people will worry." The wind lashed between them, driving the rain sideways. Malachi had no reason to trust her, no reason to invite trouble to his doorstep, but his mother's voice echoed in his mind. Be kind to strangers, especially the ones who look like they've got no one else. Without a second thought, he shrugged off his thick wool jacket. "Here," he said, draping it over her shoulders. The coat hung heavy and warm, smelling faintly of smoke and leather, its sleeves frayed from years of wear. His father's coat. Her hands stilled on the fabric, fingers curling into it as though it were worth more than gold. She looked at him then, really looked, her eyes locking onto his, like she was memorizing the shape of his face. "You would give this to me?" she asked softly. "Just until the storm passes," he replied, feeling heat rise to his cheeks despite the cold. "You're freezing." She pulled the jacket tighter, and for a long moment, they stood together in the downpour, the rest of the world muted by the sound of rain. Then she smiled, not a polite thank you, but something deeper, richer, as if the smile belonged to a part of her soul rarely seen. "My name is Ayanna, Malachi Brooks. I will remember this kindness, Malachi Brooks." And before he could offer her the shelter of his cabin, she turned and melted back into the storm, her figure swallowed by the rain until there was nothing left but the echo of her voice and the lingering warmth of the moment. He stood there long after she was gone, rain dripping from his hat brim, the taste of unanswered questions on his tongue. He didn't know it yet, but giving away that jacket had just changed everything. The morning broke sharp and cold, the kind of air that stung the lungs. Malachi stepped onto his porch with a coffee cup in hand, expecting nothing more than the quiet of his lonely spread. Instead, he froze. Along the fence line, stretching as far as his eye could follow, stood 200 warriors. They were motionless, painted faces catching the pale light, their dark eyes fixed on him. The only movement came from the slow rise and fall of their chests, the occasional flick of a horse's ear. No one spoke, no one moved. They simply watched. Malachi gripped the cup tighter, trying to keep the heat from spilling out of his trembling fingers. He could hear the faint creak of leather from their saddles even at this distance, the whisper of wind between the fence posts. The silence was heavy, the kind that carried weight and warning both. He told himself to move, to act like the master of his own land, so he walked toward the chicken coop. Their eyes followed him. He scattered feed, the grain hitting the ground in a scattershot rhythm. The hens clucked nervously, sensing what he already knew. Predators were near. When he bent to check the water trough, the hair at the back of his neck prickled. He didn't have to look to know every painted face had turned to track him. It was a strange, almost surgical kind of scrutiny, like they weren't just watching him, they were measuring him. By mid-morning, the air had grown warmer, but the chill in his gut stayed put. More riders appeared from the hills, small groups moving with the unhurried precision of men who knew they were in no danger. They joined the others without a word, filling gaps along the fence until the line was unbroken. 200 had become closer to 3. Malachi found himself counting them over and over, each time ending on a higher number. He wanted to tell himself they weren't here for him, that they were just passing through. But no one passed through in numbers like this, and no one passed through and stood so still. The coffee in his cup went cold. His breakfast sat untouched on the table inside, the eggs and bread congealing into something unappetizing. He kept glancing out the window as if they might vanish when he wasn't looking. But they didn't vanish. The warriors stood as though they had been carved from the earth itself, a human wall against the morning sun. Malachi could feel the beat of his own heart in his throat, steady but too loud. He told himself to wait, to do nothing rash. Still, as another dozen riders joined the line, he couldn't help but wonder how long they planned to watch him, and what they were waiting to do once they were done. By late morning, the stillness broke. A lone rider emerged from the far end of the line, the others parting to let him through. He was taller than the rest, broad in the shoulders, his hair braided with strips of red cloth that shifted in the breeze. An elaborate feathered headdress caught the light, though his face was bare of paint. He rode with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Malachi's pulse quickened. Instinct pushed his eyes toward the rifle above the fireplace, but reason stopped him cold. 300 warriors against one rancher, there was no defense worth dying for in that kind of math. The rider dismounted with a deliberate slowness, boots sinking into the damp earth. He closed the distance until he stood 10 paces from Malachi's porch. When he spoke, his voice was deep, unhurried, and carried without effort. "Malachi Brooks." It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," Malachi answered, stepping forward despite the knot tightening in his gut. "I am Takakota, chief of the Lakota band that travels these lands." The man's gaze was steady, unreadable. "We have come about the woman." Malachi's brow creased. "What woman?" The chief's eyes narrowed slightly, as if weighing the truth of the question. "The woman you sheltered in the storm, the one who now wears your jacket." Ayana's face flashed in Malachi's mind, rain dripping from her hair, her voice soft but certain as she spoke his name. He swallowed hard. "She was cold," he said, the words sounding thin even to his own ears. "I was just being neighborly." Something flickered in Takakota's expression, too quick for Malachi to name. "Young rancher," he said, his tone sharpening. "Do you know who she is?" "She told me her name was Ayana, that's all." The chief's gaze hardened. "She is my daughter." The air seemed to shift, growing heavier. Malachi felt the blood drain from his face. "Sir, I meant no disrespect. I didn't know." "That much is clear," Takakota said. "If you had known, you would never have dared approach her." Malachi's mind scrambled through possibilities. Was this about honor? Customs he didn't understand? He took a breath. "Where is she now?" "That," Takakota said, "is why we are here. Ayana left our camp 2 days ago and should have returned before the storm. When our scouts found her horse this morning, she was not with it. She has not come home." A ripple moved through the warriors behind him, quiet but unmistakable. The weight of 300 stares pressed on Malachi like a stone. The chief stepped closer, his shadow falling across the porch. "You," he said, "were the last to see my daughter alive." The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of horses and damp earth. Takakota's eyes never left Malachi's face, studying him like a man reading a map for hidden traps. "She did not vanish into the night," the chief said at last. "Someone took her." His voice was low, but each word landed like the crack of a hammer. "And you, Malachi Brooks, were the last to see her." Malachi felt his jaw tighten. "I didn't harm her. I offered her my cabin, but she said her people would worry. She walked away into the storm." Takakota stepped closer until Malachi could see the faint silver lines of old scars on his cheek. "If that were true, and nothing more, I would not be standing here with 300 warriors." He glanced toward the fence line, where the line of painted faces stood as steady as the hills. "My daughter knows these plains better than any hunter in my band. She is the finest rider we have. For her to be found without her horse means something or someone drove her to the ground before she reached safety." Malachi's mind flashed back to the way she had kept looking over her shoulder that night, the tightness in her voice, the weight in her steps. "She seemed scared," he admitted quietly, "but not of me." Takakota's eyes narrowed, the faintest nod acknowledging the truth in that. Exactly. Someone was following her. Someone she recognized. That is why I believe the one who took her is no stranger. "You think it's someone from your own tribe?" The chief's gaze hardened. "A woman alone in these lands has many enemies, but only a man she trusted could have gotten close enough to take her without a fight. That is why you are here." Malachi blinked. "Here? You brought all these men to accuse me?" "No!" Takakota's voice cut across his like the snap of a whip. "I brought them because you may be the only one who can help me find her." The words landed heavy, not with kindness but with a grim sort of necessity. "You know where you last saw her. You know which direction she went. And most importantly," Takakota's tone dropped to something colder, "you are an outsider. Whoever took her will not expect you to ride with me. They will not hide their guilt from your eyes the way they do from mine." Malachi looked past the chief to the wall of warriors, painted faces, unreadable eyes. Any one of them could be the man they sought. "And if I refuse?" Takakota's jaw tightened. "Then I will believe you had a hand in her disappearance, and my people will act accordingly." Malachi swallowed hard. The bargain was clear, his innocence for her life. "When do we leave?" he asked. "Now," the chief said, "before the one who took her ensures she never speaks again." The column of riders stretched long across the open plains, the sound of hooves drumming a steady rhythm into the earth. Malachi kept close to Takakota at the front, the chief's hawk-like gaze sweeping the horizon as if he could pull a trail from thin air. The wind was sharp in Malachi's face, carrying the mingled scents of leather, horse sweat, and the faint smoke of distant fires. Takakota spoke without turning his head. "There are 3 men, I suspect. All wanted my daughter. All were refused." Malachi's hands tightened on the reins. "Who?" "Kitchi," the chief said. "Young, quick to anger. He believes skill in the hunt makes him worthy of any woman. He has never heard the word no without taking offense." Malachi glanced over his shoulder at the riders behind them. "Is he with us now?" Takakota nodded toward a figure near the front of the group. The man rode stiff in the saddle, jaw set, his tattoos winding down his arms like snakes. His eyes, when they flicked toward Malachi, held nothing of welcome. "The second is Chaitan," Takakota went on, "older, patient. His ambition is to lead when I am gone, and he sees my daughter as the path to that." Malachi scanned the line again. "Is he here too?" "No, he stayed behind to guard your ranch." The way Takakota said it left little doubt that the choice had been deliberate. "And the third?" "Maddo," the chief said, his tone hardening. "Violent. Does not accept rejection. He has broken men's bones for less than being denied my daughter's hand." Malachi kept his eyes forward, but he felt the weight of the words settling in his chest. "And you think one of them took her?" Takakota's silence was answer enough. The further they rode, the more Malachi noticed the strange currents running through the group. Conversations faltered when he drew near. Glances darted between certain riders, quick and sharp, like signals passed without words. Even the horses seemed to catch the tension, ears twitching at sudden shifts in tone. He tried to remember what Takakota had told him. Watch their faces. See who grows uneasy when the chief chooses a direction. It was harder than he thought. Every man here was skilled at keeping his thoughts behind a mask, and the painted lines across their cheeks made reading them even harder. But unease had a way of leaking through the cracks. A glance held too long, a hand tightening on a rein, the faint curl of a lip when they thought no one was watching. By the time the sun began to slide westward, Malachi could feel it in his bones. Someone riding among them already knew where Ayana was, and that someone was doing their best to make sure the rest of them never got there. The trail had been faint at first, just the occasional bent stem of grass, the shallow print of a moccasin pressed into damp soil. But Takakota moved like a man reading a story written for his eyes alone, never hesitating as he led them deeper into the wilderness. Malachi followed close, scanning the ground, though he knew he wouldn't see what the chief saw. Then Takakota stopped so abruptly that the line of riders behind him rippled to a halt. He slid from his horse, crouched low, and brushed his fingers over a cluster of rocks. When he straightened, his face was carved from stone. "Blood," he said. Malachi dismounted, stepping closer. Dark stains marked the pale rock, faint but undeniable. His stomach knotted. "How much?" "Not enough to kill," Takakota said, "but enough to slow her, and enough to tell me she was injured before she crossed here." Beyond the rocks, the ground opened into a wide patch of trampled grass where the trail split three ways, one veering toward the river, another climbing toward the low mountains, the third looping back in the general direction of Malachi's ranch. Kitchi rode forward, his expression sharp. "Chief, we should split our forces. Follow all three trails at once. If she is wounded and hiding, speed is our only advantage." A murmur of agreement ran through several warriors. Malachi caught the quick glance Kitchi sent to two men riding further back, the kind of look that said more than words ever could. Takakota studied the three paths for a long moment. The wind tugged at the feathers in his hair, but his eyes stayed fixed on the ground. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but edged with steel. "No." Kitchi straightened in the saddle. "If we delay, if we split," Takakota cut in, "we give them exactly what they want. They want us scattered, chasing shadows while they slip away with my daughter." Silence rolled through the group like distant thunder. Malachi could feel it, the shift in the air, the hardening of expressions, the subtle flecks of hands on weapons. The chief had just declared, without naming names, that one of his own men might be the enemy. It wasn't just suspicion anymore, it was personal. Malachi let his gaze move over the warriors. He saw it in more than one face. Not worry for Ayana, but the tight, watchful unease of men whose plans had just been disrupted. Whatever Takakota was reading in the dirt, some of them clearly didn't like it. "We follow the river," Takakota said at last, turning his horse toward the water. "That trail carries the most weight in the steps. The others are meant to fool us." As they moved out, Malachi's grip on the reins tightened. He didn't need Takakota's eyes to know the truth. This wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. It was a hunt for a traitor, and the traitor was riding with them. The river was swollen from the storm, its muddy banks carved with fresh scars where the water had bitten deep. The air smelled of wet earth and moss, the steady rush of current masking the sounds of the riders as they dismounted to search along the shore. Takakota moved slow, eyes sweeping over prints and scuffs Malachi could barely see. "She crossed here," the chief said finally, pointing to a line of shallow, uneven steps pressed into the mud. "But not by choice. Her stride is wrong. Someone was forcing her to move faster than her injury allowed." Malachi's gut tightened. He imagined Ayanna limping along the bank, pushed forward by a shadow at her back, the roar of the river swallowing any chance of calling for help. "Upstream," a sharp voice called out. "Chief, over here!" They hurried toward the sound. Kitchi stood beside a low-hanging branch, pointing to something caught in it. Even from a distance, Malachi recognized the rough wool, the faded seams, his jacket. Takakota reached it first, untying the sleeves from where they'd been knotted around the branch. "She left it for us," he said softly. "A sign." But Malachi's eyes caught on something else. The jacket wasn't tangled by chance. It had been tied deliberately, placed in plain view. He stepped closer and saw a strip of bark tucked into one of the pockets. "There's something here," he said. The chief took it from him, turning it in his hands. Words had been scratched into the surface with blackened charcoal. The lines rough but legible. Malachi couldn't read them, but the way Takakota's expression shifted told him enough. "What does it say?" he asked. Takakota's voice was quiet, but the words carried weight. "The daughter pays for the father's crimes. Sunset tomorrow, or she dies." The river's rush filled the silence that followed, the meaning settling like cold iron in Malachi's chest. "Crimes?" The chief's jaw tightened. "Last winter, a warrior from another band, Akachita, accused me of stealing his family's horses. He challenged me. I defeated him, spared his life. He swore I would regret it." Takakota's gaze drifted to the line of warriors behind them, hard and unblinking. He could not have taken her alone. Someone told him where she would be and when. Malachi followed his stare. Painted faces gave nothing away, but he thought he saw it. A flicker of recognition passing between a few men, the kind of shared knowledge that didn't belong here. "This isn't just ransom," Malachi said quietly. "It's a message. He wants more than your daughter." Takakota nodded grimly. "He wants my place, and to get it, he will make me choose between my honor and her life." The current hissed against the bank, and the weight of the deadline pressed in from all sides. Sunset tomorrow, less than a day to find her before the river claimed more than just its banks. The canyon walls rose on either side, sheer and close, the sunlight narrowing to a thin ribbon above their heads. Hooves echoed off the stone, each strike sounding sharper in the confined space. Malachi's grip on the reins tightened. He didn't like it here. There was no wind, no wide sky, no place to run. Takakota rode ahead, his eyes scanning the rocky slopes as if expecting them to move. The line of warriors stretched behind, their shadows shifting over the canyon floor. Somewhere in that column, Malachi reminded himself, rode a man who had already chosen betrayal over loyalty. The first arrow hissed down from above, burying itself in the dirt inches from his boot. Another followed, then another, until the air seemed to sing with him. Shouts erupted from the cliffs, the echoes bouncing until it was impossible to tell where the voices came from. "Cover!" Takakota roared. Warriors broke for the shelter of boulders and outcroppings, returning fire where they could. Horses reared and screamed, the canyon filling with the chaos of battle. Malachi dropped low in the saddle, heart hammering, when movement on the far wall caught his eye. Kitchi, still on horseback, wasn't taking cover. He was standing high in his stirrups, one arm raised, fingers moving in sharp, deliberate gestures. Signals. "Kitchi!" Malachi shouted, pointing. "He's with them!" Takakota's head snapped toward where Malachi was pointing. In one smooth motion, the chief drew his bow, the string singing as he loosed an arrow. It struck Kitchi high in the shoulder, spinning him from the saddle and sending him crashing to the canyon floor. His horse bolted, disappearing into the dust and noise. The attackers faltered for a moment, confusion rippling through their ranks. Takakota pressed the advantage, calling to his warriors in a voice that cut through the din. Arrows answered arrows, and the canyon filled with the sharp clash of metal on stone. Malachi ducked behind a jagged rock, scanning the ledges for any sign of Ayana. Nothing, only shadows darting between cover, the glint of weapons, the occasional flash of painted skin. She could be here. She could already be gone. The fight surged and broke in waves, each exchange pushing the attackers higher up the canyon walls until they began to retreat. Takakota's men pressed after them, but the chief stayed near Kichi's crumpled form. Blood darkened the young warrior's sleeve, his face pale but twisted in defiance. Even wounded, his eyes carried no fear, only hatred, and something else Malachi couldn't place. When the last arrow fell silent, the canyon held its breath. The ambush had failed, but the dust it left behind felt heavier than victory. Ayana was still somewhere out there, her fate a question mark, and now they knew for certain her enemy wasn't only waiting ahead. He had been riding with them all along. Dust still hung in the air when Malachi's gaze snagged on a flash of movement high up the north wall, a swaying edge of buckskin against the stone. He squinted through the glare, heart leaping when the shape resolved into Ayana. She was bound at the wrists and ankles, a gag cutting across her face, but her eyes were open, locked on the chaos below. "She's up there!" Malachi shouted to Takakota, pointing. The chief's glance was quick, his answer grim. "Too exposed. They'll kill her before we can reach her." But Malachi was already moving. He broke from cover, ignoring the shouts behind him, his boots skidding on loose shale as he found the first handhold. The climb bit into his muscles, every step a fight against the pull of gravity and the pounding in his chest. Above, the edge of Ayana's form was a constant anchor, keeping him from looking down at the dizzying drop. Arrows hissed past once, twice, clattering harmlessly against the stone. Whether by luck or their distraction with the fight below, none found him. By the time he hauled himself onto the narrow ledge, his hands were raw and his lungs burned. Ayana's gaze softened in instant recognition. He knelt, cutting the ropes at her wrists with his knife, then worked at the knots around her ankles. When the gag came free, she drew in a sharp breath. "It was Kichi," she said, voice hoarse. "He told Akachita where to find me." "I know," Malachi said, helping her to her feet. "Your father knows too, but we're not safe yet." She shook her head, glancing toward a dark crevice behind them. "There's another way down. They won't see us until it's too late." The path was little more than a goat trail carved into the cliff, hidden by brush and rock. Ayana moved with the sure-footedness of someone born to this land, guiding him in silence until the canyon floor spread out before them from a new angle. They crouched behind a cluster of boulders, and that's when Malachi saw him. Akacheta crouched behind cover, barking orders to the men still fighting. "Can you use that rifle?" Ayana asked, nodding to the weapon slung across his back. "Not well," Malachi admitted. "Then give it to me." Her hands were steady as she chambered around, her cheeks settling against the stock like it was second nature. The shot cracked through the canyon, echoing sharp and final. Akachita jerked, clutching his thigh, and went down hard. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the enemy line broke, their leader's fall unraveling their will like a cut rope. Takakota's warriors surged forward, overwhelming what was left. Malachi watched Ayana lower the rifle, her expression unreadable in the settling dust. She didn't look at him until the shouting faded, and when she did, the faintest smile touched her lips, quiet, fierce, and certain. The canyon was quiet now, save for the groans of the wounded and the soft jingle of horses shifting in the dust. The air still smelled of sweat and gunpowder, sharp and heavy, but the fight was over. Akacheta lay bound near the base of a boulder, his leg wrapped in a strip of torn cloth. Nearby, Kitchie sat with his back against the stone, pale from blood loss, his eyes darting anywhere but toward Takakota. Two other warriors, men Malachi had seen riding in the column, were held under guard, faces grim, the weight of their betrayal plain for all to see. Takakota moved among his men like a storm losing none of its force in the aftermath, his voice low but firm as he gave orders. When he reached Malachi and Ayana, he stopped. For a long moment he simply looked at them, his dark eyes searching Malachi's face the way he might study the horizon for signs of danger. "You climbed a canyon wall to save my daughter," he said at last. "That is not something I expected from you, Malachi Brooks." Malachi felt the sting of his scraped palms, the pull of every muscle in his arms, but all he said was, "Seemed like the thing to do." The chief's mouth curved, not quite into a smile, but close enough to carry warmth. "You will always be welcome in our camp. Any man who risks his life for my blood is counted among my people." Ayana stepped forward then, the wool jacket folded over her arm. It was damp from the river air, the seams frayed, the smell of smoke and leather still clinging to it. "You should have this back," she said softly. Malachi looked at the coat, then at her, the memory of that night in the storm flickering between them. "Keep it," he said. "Something tells me it suits you better." Her smile this time was small but unguarded, the kind that reached her eyes. She tucked the jacket back under her arm as if it belonged there. They rode out together in the fading light, the prisoners in tow, the line of warriors moving as one. The sun bled gold and red across the horizon, catching on the feathers in Takakota's headdress, glinting off the steel tips of spears. When the familiar outline of Malachi's ranch came into view, he realized how different it looked now. Not because the land had changed, but because he had. 3 days ago, he'd been a man with more silence than company, with chores to fill the hours and nothing to anchor him but the fence around his land. Now he carried the weight and the pride of men who had fought beside him, the memory of a woman's fierce eyes meeting his in the rain, and the knowledge that he had not turned away when it mattered most. By the time the sun dropped below the hills, Malachi Brooks was no longer just a rancher. He was a man with a place, and people who would ride for him as surely as he had ridden for them. That's the end of the trail, folks. Drop a yes if you're a true Wild West fan. Thanks for riding with me.